Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Ukrainian War Intelligence Update for the 25th of February 2022, and it is being recorded at 0100 Eastern Time on the 25th, which is also 0800 Ukrainian time. So let's get right to it. In the geopolitical sphere throughout Europe, really the theme has been mostly squabbling over the past 24 to 48 hours. When it comes to sanctions, to put it lightly, attempts to sanction Russia with anything meaningful have been a complete and utter failure. I hate to keep ragging on various European agencies for this, even though it's quite easy to do, but what we have seen coming from the UN and the EU over the past 24 hours has been just quite embarrassing with regards to their sanctions attempts on Russia. So I think that it's, again, like I mentioned last time, kind of laughable to think that sanctions can impact Russia in any meaningful way, or you can't sanction your way out of an invasion, which a lot of people seem to think is an option. But when it comes to the specific issues that have been plaguing Europe at this time, and really any time Europe tries to get together to sanction an entity, it's that everybody wants something different. Most nations in Europe want to sanction different things or not sanction certain things. In any case, nobody seems to want to agree on anything, which is a problem. A lot of people have brought up the possibility of removing Russia from the SWIFT banking system, which would be slightly more than a slap on the wrist for Russia, and that might actually complicate things for them, maybe. I don't think it'll have too much difference, but I'm not a financial expert or really know what ways that would harm Russia. But my personal guess is that this isn't going to happen. I would bet that most nations in Europe are just stalling for time on the sanctions front. As a side note, on the sanctions front, whatever slap on the wrist sanctions are going to go through, you can bet that this is going to affect your life here in the United States real quick. For instance, the U.S. has tried to talk about sanctioning things like trade and banking. Well, with regards to trade, one particular thing that has increased in price over just the past day or so is fertilizer. The United States imports a lot of fertilizer from Russia, so since that trade is likely to be sanctioned, or maybe it already has been sanctioned, I just haven't picked it up yet, prices for fertilizer go up. Prices for fertilizer have already gone up in the international sphere, and as we've been talking about in our other briefs, there has been a mass global fertilizer shortage of all kinds of fertilizers. So when the prices for various fertilizers go up, the prices for your food goes up as well. This applies to other things too, like energy, but my guess, again, is that Europe is not going to touch the energy sector too much with Russia. Europe is, again, simply too reliant on Russian natural resources at this stage for any significant sanctions to hit Russia's energy sector. Something that has also raised many eyebrows today has been the invocation of Article 4 of the NATO Charter. So far, 4 nations have invoked Article 4. That would be the classic 3, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland as well. For those of you who don't understand or don't know what Article 4 of the NATO Charter is, really it's just a clause within the NATO Charter that allows members of NATO to hold consultations when they feel that their territorial integrity is in jeopardy. Basically, it's the dinner bell to bring all NATO members together in the same room to talk about what's going on because one NATO member thinks they're about to get invaded. So, again, it's not Article 5. Article 5 is the big one, which is basically an attack on one is an attack on all. And that hasn't been invoked just yet. Article 4 is kind of like the prelude to that. And it makes sense at this stage. This is not anything to panic about for sure. It's a little troubling because, Article 4 means pretty big business, but it's not something that's like, oh my gosh, World War III is starting because of this. So this is something to be completely expected, especially from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. These 4 nations are kind of right there. They're the first kind of, or really the last bastion between Russia and the rest of Europe. So it makes sense for them to kind of trigger this and talk about Russia's actions in Ukraine. Something also that's kind of interesting I saw being thrown around today was the idea of Finland possibly joining NATO. I don't really think that's a serious thought. It is interesting, and I think that it would be very interesting to see what Russia would do in that front, because, again, Russia and Finland have a very long history. They share a border. It's kind of an interesting relationship there. I don't think that Finland's going to be up for NATO membership anytime soon, but I think that it's kind of interesting that they're talking about that potential. So who knows? This might be a chance for Finland, and you know what, Sweden, for that matter, to join NATO or join on. I don't know if that's, again, really a serious thing, but it's interesting, and I think that somebody's trying to make us think that it's serious because both Finland and Sweden have been invited to the table at the NATO Security Conference tomorrow. So, interesting, maybe. Something to keep an eye on. I would not be terribly surprised, whatever happens either way, but I just wanted to mention it because it's kind of interesting. Also, within Russia, we're seeing a lot of civil disobedience, a lot of protests in the streets over Russia's launch of this invasion. Particularly in Moscow as well as St. Petersburg, we're seeing really hundreds and hundreds of protesters take to the streets to protest their own country's involvement in Ukraine, which is utterly fascinating, to be honest. So what Putin is having to deal with right now, again, this is something he has historically been very hypersensitive to, but he's having to deal a lot with domestic concerns right now. And I would be very curious as to see how this is going to go down. Of course, protesting in Russia, especially protesting anything that has to do with Vladimir Putin, that's going to get cracked down with an iron fist, right? So that's just the way this is. That's what Russia is well known for at this point. Alexei Navalny taught us that, right? So it's going to be interesting to see where these protests go and how big they get. I don't think it's going to have any impact whatsoever on military actions within Ukraine, but again, it's interesting, so I wanted to point it out. Moving on to the naval updates, don't have a whole lot for the North Sea, so I'm going to have to come back to that later. Same thing with the Med. I will say that right now there's a lot of Russian vessels in the Med and in the Black Sea. We don't know exactly where they're at, but I'll come back to these Russian landing ships, task forces here in just a bit. On the grand strategic front here, overall, Russia continues her advance into Ukraine on all fronts, with some lines of effort making better progress than others, which we'll touch on when we get into the specific fronts. But one thing that I wanted to mention now, because I don't really have anywhere else to put it, is an observation that we noticed yesterday, but has become more apparent today. And that is Russia's hesitance to use large percentages of her forces at this time. Yes, we are seeing attacks and advances along all of the front lines, right? But it's not to the level of an all-out, throw everything they've got forward kind of thing. This could change in an instant, of course, but it seems like Russia is moving hesitantly and only committing the bare essential forces to meet an objective. Now, of course, if you're into military strategy and things like that, that kind of makes sense, right? You don't want to, waste a lot of your forces up front when you know that there's going to be a prolonged fight ahead of you, right? But this could also be a problem for Russia moving forward because Russian forces are already starting to face more resistance than they expected along a couple of fronts. And if Russian forces get bogged down, this is going to present problems for them. Now, whether or not Ukrainian forces will be able to capitalize on Russia's strategic errors, that remains to be known, but in all honesty, that's not very likely on the strategic stage. Though Ukrainian forces have demonstrated that some units have learned from their mistakes in the past and can coordinate to fight and win localized victories, which is something that Russia is certainly taking note of. Before we move on, I wanted to show a brief map of where most of the major significant airstrikes or cruise missile strikes or Grad strikes have been occurring. Really, it's all over the country. And again, like I mentioned yesterday, critical infrastructure, military targets, military bases that they don't really particularly need, or the home bases for political targets and things like that. So we're not exactly seeing deliberate targeting of civilians in a lot of areas, but we are seeing that in some areas. On the Northeastern Front, most of the activity today has been centered in the towns of Kharkiv and Sumy. Russia has been conducting strikes on the outskirts of Kharkiv all day and night. In fact, I have a clip here to show you the kinds of strikes that have been occurring in Kharkiv. We haven't been able to 100% verify this specific clip, so take it with a grain of salt as always. This is really just to show everyone what a strike from a multiple launch rocket system, or MLRS, looks like.
Вот оно куда упало. Нихуя себе, блядь. Да, сука, там зачистили вообще, блядь, все к ебеням. Дрожат. Ты шо, ты шо?
Again, with misinformation running rampant right now, we couldn't 100% verify that this is Kharkiv, right? But even if it isn't, this is exactly what the strikes on Kharkiv have looked like for hours now. To the northwest of Kharkiv, in the village of Sumy, locals are reporting that much of the city has been encircled by Russian forces. We've seen Russian armor within the city pretty much all day, and that large Russian armored columns are now bypassing the city and heading to Kiev. Along the Eastern Front, we have witnessed intense fighting, with Mariupol being the major source of information, as it is a decently large city with a civilian population, which have been reporting on the shelling that has been occurring since the invasion began. Shelling which has been intense. We don't have a super great idea of how the battle for Mariupol is going, but so far it seems quite brutal. Both Ukrainian and Russian forces have claimed to have taken the city or retaken the city, but right now, as with many other locations along the front, the city of Mariupol remains a contested area. The Southern Front has seen the most significant Russian advances today, with Ukrainian forces tactically retreating or just wide open terrain, allowing Russian forces from Crimea to advance from Crimea about 60 kilometers north to Kherson City. There, fighting has been raging all day as Ukrainian forces have been able to mount an effective defense. Again, reports are conflicting as to whether or not Russia has taken Kherson yet, so this terrain is still very much contested at the moment. However, once Russia does take the city, they will have an effective bridge over the Dnieper River and will begin to threaten Odessa's flank. Also, something to keep an eye on is Odessa and Mariupol itself with regards to amphibious attacks. We still haven't seen the amphibious craft that we know are in the area. It's really hard to kind of keep a track on where these guys are at, but really we and lots of others are expecting an amphibious assault to occur sometime pretty soon. One minor amphibious assault that has already occurred has been the Snake Island, which is so small that it doesn't show up on the map, but you can see it to the left of the slide there. That is now in Russian control. It's a very small training base. It's been a historical training location, very small island outpost for Ukrainian special forces, and reporting indicates that all 13 or 14 of the Ukrainian soldiers were killed while defending that island. So 100% casualty rate for that particular conflict there. Along the Western Front, really no major updates from last time. Still haven't quite figured out what's going on there. It appears to be there's a combination of either celebratory gunfire or legitimate gunfire or something going on there. We do know that Moldova itself is actually trying to set up humanitarian operations and set up locations for refugees to be staged once they egress from Ukraine. And that doesn't appear to be affecting anything, so not really sure what's going on in Transnistria, but it doesn't really seem to be significant, so we'll skip over it for now. Along the Northwestern Front, most of the combat we have seen has been in the Chernobyl exclusion zone today, which we'll get to in just a minute, but we've also seen a lot of conflict taking place to the east, to the northeast of Kiev in the town of Chernihiv. In Chernihiv, we have seen significant armored battles with Ukrainian forces and Russian forces really holding their own against each other pretty much all day. And right now it seems like Ukraine still holds the city, but there has been significant fighting all day and night there. Before we move on to Kiev, I briefly wanted to mention what's been going on at Chernobyl. There have been increased detections of radiation within the Chernobyl exclusion zone, particularly around the spent fuel storage pools in the vicinity of the actual Chernobyl power plant itself. Of course, none of us here are radiological experts, but it looks like, based on the data coming out of the remote sensors in the area, that radiation levels have spiked quite significantly. Now, based on the data that we're seeing and a lot of what other people are kind of speculating on at the moment, this appears to be for two reasons. For one, there's an awful lot of shelling going on. When you've got an MLRS trying to erase grid squares and just basically churn the earth in certain locations, you're going to churn up a lot of radiological dust, and that's going to trip your sensors, of course, right? So yeah, stirring up dust is not good, but that's more of a localized problem. The other cause for this is what everybody's kind of thinking and what the Ukrainian government has confirmed, as much as the Ukrainian government can confirm right now. Because Chernobyl is currently in Russian hands, the Ukrainian government has confirmed that a radiological waste site has been struck by Russian artillery, and that is, that splitting open has caused the sensors to pick up these increased levels of radiation. Again, really hard to say, because this up until a few hours ago was, it still probably is, a very kinetic combat zone. Lots of fighting going on up there. Russia barely took this area from the Ukrainians, and they currently hold the Chernobyl power plant. So it's really going to be hard to tell what damage has been done. International monitors are probably not going to be able to get in there for a while. So yeah, best we can do and the best rest of Europe can do is, just like the first time, just kind of monitor sensors and see how this goes. But for right now, just so everybody has some kind of number to work with, the background radiation in Chernobyl, the Chernobyl exclusion zone, right there, right beside Reactor 4, is around about 3,000 nanosieverts per hour. And right now, that same sensor, whose average is 3,000, is now picking up over 65,500 nanosieverts per hour. So, yeah, not super great. Don't really know what this means from a health perspective, but it does seem like this is largely localized in the area for now. But again, Chernobyl has a way of kind of being way worse than anybody thought, right? So again, we'll be keeping an eye on this as we move forward. In Kiev, most of the combat today has been centered around the Antonov airport. Historically, this airport is mostly used for super heavy cargo operations and is, obviously a primary goal of Russian airborne forces, who have been trying to take it all night last night and all day today as well. Earlier today, reporting indicated that Ukrainian forces had fended off Russia's assault and downed as many as 6 Russian helicopters that were taking part in the assault for the airport, and subsequently engaging Russian forces decisively, requiring the survivors of the assault to disperse into the nearby countryside. However, it seems that at some point Russia regained the initiative and retook the airport sometime during the day, but then lost it again. Either way, it's really hard to say what actually went down today at the Antonov airport. But it would be safe to say that the Antonov airport has traded hands a couple of times today, and since Russia has demonstrated that the Antonov airport facility is an important strategic objective, we will consider this location as contested for the time being. Out east at the major civilian airport of Boryspil, there hasn't been much news other than sporadic fighting in the immediate area of the airport, presumably by Russian airborne forces. Several Russian helicopters are reported to have been shot down during the initial raid on this airport, and some video footage indicates this as well, but again, information is really murky surrounding the Boryspil airport right now. But again, thinking strategically, every day that Russia has to fight for an objective and loses is a day that they are behind schedule. And it seems like most analysts and entities out there, ourselves included, think that it's pretty clear that Russia fell short of meeting her day one goals. Ukrainian President Zelensky is still in Kiev, though he himself has confirmed that his family is in a safe location. Additionally, he has stated today that Russian special forces and saboteurs are within the city. This is to be expected. Russian forces would have had to have been on the ground in Kiev for many days before this invasion began. Also, another interesting bit of information is a rumor that's been going around surrounding a lone Ukrainian pilot flying around Kiev in an old MiG-29 today, who was allegedly downed between 4 and 6 Russian aircraft. Again, this is just a rumor right now, but dozens of people in the streets have seen and photographed this unknown pilot, or possibly pilots. It might be more than one person. So obviously this very well could be just morale-boosting propaganda, right? When wars break out, these kinds of romantic stories come out, right? But this unknown pilot has been dubbed the Ghost of Kiev. So I thought it was kind of interesting, so I thought I'd share it. Moving back to a more strategic view for a moment, I briefly wanted to talk about the civilian front, or some considerations that civilians are going to have moving forward in trying to egress from the country or being informed enough to stay if that's their choice. So far, the United Nations, if you can trust their numbers, estimate that roughly 100,000 people have been displaced from their homes. But again, this has happened so quickly, and there are so many fronts that are open all at the same time that it's really hard to guess, and that number is almost certainly much, much higher than that. For those who are trying to leave Ukraine, there are quite a few challenges. First up are logistical challenges, right? There is, of course, a nationwide gasoline shortage. This occurs because people are, of course, trying to buy all the gas at once, and with traffic jams, the already strained logistics basically come to a grinding halt, right? So some people might find that they have no trouble finding gasoline to fill up their cars. But others might find that they haven't had gasoline since the invasion started. So really hard to say where these shortages are going to occur at, but you can bet that it's probably going to affect the entire country over the next few days. As far as Russia targeting civilians, I'll talk about that here in just a moment, but I wanted to briefly on this slide mention that civcas, or civilian casualties, are being reported in Odessa, which makes a lot of sense due to the close proximity of the port. It's a very densely populated area. It's not a very big city, but it's pretty dense. The military base is kind of cramped there a little bit. So it would make sense that Russian forces targeting those areas would result in a lot of civilian casualties. Plus, of course, the civilian port city side of things. And also in Kharkiv, we're seeing a lot of residential areas be targeted in Kharkiv, and that will likely continue as Ukrainian forces pull back into the city. So far, we're not seeing too many strikes occur within the city of Kharkiv, but we are seeing the oddball strike here and there, and they're not exactly hitting military targets, although military targets were like the first ones taken out. So an apartment building here, another apartment building there, that's kind of what we're seeing in Kharkiv. But let's move on to the traffic. Just briefly wanted to show kind of a screenshot of Google Maps at the moment. Now, of course, Google Maps is highly dynamic, and of course using people's smartphones to track where they're at to give us these nice traffic maps, right? But as you can see, the main highway heading west, Highway 40 there, has significant portions of that highway closed, and that is heavily affecting all of the other secondary roads, which are now showing up as orange because they have significant delays. Moving just a little bit further west, we can see again just a sea of orange roads as people try to maneuver their way around either military actions or traffic. It's really hard to say if there's a clear route at all to the border right now. It's just taking forever to get from one place to another, and it's going to be a long, drawn-out affair if you try to make it to the border by vehicle. And again, once you get to the border, you face other challenges as well. Right now, pretty much every checkpoint along the Polish border looks exactly like this. It's backed up for many, many miles as people try to make their way into Poland. Right now, we don't even know if Poland is actually taking Ukrainian citizens. We know that Poland has, over the past few days, said that they're taking American citizens. You can get your visa and stuff right there at the border. That should be no problem for Americans. Not sure about any other nationality, though, but really a lot of nations throughout Europe are being really hesitant on taking Ukrainian refugees. So you might find that you can get all the way to the border, but you have trouble with immigration, right? So something also to consider is Ukraine's martial law and declaring a general mobilization, basically meaning that every male aged 18 to 60 are now prohibited from leaving the country. So yeah, this is a very tough time, obviously. So that's something to think about as well for egress. So jumping back to civilian casualties for just a moment, a lot of people have brought up the idea that Russia is only going for military targets and is looking to topple the Ukrainian government, not really going after civilians. Our thoughts on that are that this is generally true, but we also must remember the unspoken caveats that come with Russian combat actions. The Russian military doesn't really have any regard at all for civilian casualties. We have seen this in Syria, we've seen it in Georgia, we've seen it in Chechnya, and we saw it yesterday in Ukraine. So right now, it doesn't look like the Russians are intentionally targeting civilians as a whole, although, like I mentioned, there is evidence of this in Kharkiv. But the Russians clearly do not care if civilians are in their way. Russians don't have to meet the 6 pillars of targeting, they don't have a Cat 1 no-strike list, and they don't care at all about CivCAS or population density estimates. So with that in mind, if civilians can weather this invasion or are already behind enemy lines, staying put might be the better option for now. And like I mentioned, we also have to remember that as this humanitarian crisis grows, fewer and fewer nations will be accepting of refugees, so you might travel all the way across Ukraine through a war zone just for a Polish border guard to not grant you a visa. Nothing is certain right now, and European nations have been extremely hesitant to confirm that they will be providing refuge for displaced persons. Like I mentioned, Moldova has stepped up, but again, they haven't taken that many yet, and their tone might change with time. For the people who are living in cities or heavily urbanized areas, just know that these areas are already targets, and as Russian forces close in on these urbanized areas, where the defender has the advantage, the civilian casualties that we will be seeing will most likely rise very sharply as Russia begins targeting the civilian populace even more deliberately than they already are. So the decision to stay and hopefully make it through an invasion unscathed to eventually become a Russian citizen, that might be an option for many. One thing that people tend to forget a lot of times is that some people either cannot or will not leave their home. Some people simply do not have the option to flee and resettle to a different country, so we are keeping these tough choices in mind as well. So that's all we've got for right now, everyone. Thank you for your support, and thanks for watching. Remember, everything is subject to change, and even though Russia's advances right now are decently slow, or at least slower than Russia would like them to be, this can change very quickly. So remember, this is going to be a video that's going to be on the internet for literally ever, and we can't change it after it's uploaded, other than making some minor corrections in the description box. But again, we'll update you as time goes on. I don't know if we're going to be able to keep up these daily updates. We're certainly going to try, at least until things reach sort of a status quo. But for the moment, everybody's kind of doing what we're doing, which is watching and waiting. So again, thank you for your support, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.